Hello, I'm Professor Carol Senf from the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta, Georgia, United States. I have worked on Bram Stoker for more years than I care to admit, and have worked on The New Woman and Bram Stoker for almost as long. So I'm happy to share what I know. My biggest disappointment, though, when I was invited to do this was I hoped to integrate some Darwin. And I was unable to do that. It turns out that Darwin did not have anything to say about either blood or the new woman. So here is the paper, which I've titled Dracula, Blood, and the New Woman, Stoker's Reflections on the Zeitgeist.
Good evening and welcome to the fourth lecture in the 2021 Darwin College Lecture Series on blood. Last week, Professor Tim Pedley from here at Cambridge University gave us a wonderful, clear exposition of the fluid mechanics of blood flow. This week, we move from applied mathematics to literary history with Professor Carol Senf and her groundbreaking studies of Abraham Stoker's novel Dracula, and what we learn from this extraordinary work of fiction about how blood, vampirism, and the female ideal of the new woman were viewed at that time in history. Carol joins us from the Georgia Institute of Technology, where she's a professor in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication. Her teaching and scholarship have focused on Victorian literature and culture, the Gothic, and gender and feminist studies, among many other things. As you know, we're unable to have a live audience, sadly, here in Lady Mitchell Hall in Cambridge this year, but we're really grateful to so many of you who are joining us online, live instead. And we also thank our speakers who've made time to pre-record their lectures online during the challenges that this pandemic has presented to us all. The lectures will of course remain online, so please do share the details of our YouTube channel with anyone who you think might enjoy tonight's talk. The title of Carol's lecture is Dracula, Vampires, and the New Woman. I do hope you enjoy it.
Students of the long 19th century know that people during that time felt particularly ill-equipped to handle the rapid changes taking place, and that many felt like the persona of Arnold's Dover Beach. Speaking to his beloved, he thinks of sadness and human misery, concluding there is nothing for them but love, because the larger world has, quote, neither joy nor love nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain, end quote, amidst the, quote, confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night, end quote. We in 2021 may be less apprehensive about the speed with which change occurs, but we have our own angst to confront and can engage with what troubled or delighted our ancestors in the popular literature that most transparently reveals those concerns. While almost everyone who writes on Stoker classifies him as a popular writer, or at least as the anchor author of one enormously popular book, David Glover puts Stoker's desire for popularity at the center of Vampires, Mummies, and Liberals, Bram Stoker and the Politics of Popular Fiction, and observes that he must be read, quote, as he most wanted to be read, as a popular writer, end quote. Although the current study focuses on Dracula, I share Stoker's concern that readers overemphasize Dracula without recognizing that Stoker's entire oeuvre addresses, quote, questions of nationhood, character, and sexuality, and the close links between them, end quote. And I have elsewhere written on Stoker's interest in what troubled and delighted his contemporaries. including the rise of science, medicine, and technology, England's relationship to her colonies and fear of an uprising, changing gender roles, and the rise of the United States as a world power. The following paper looks at a subset of these issues, focusing on the significance of blood and the impact of the new woman. While I am swayed by Glover's argument that Stoker experimented with popular forms to address social anxieties, his interest in contemporary issues was firmly ingrained, the result of family life and education. Although Bram followed his father, for whom he is named, into the Irish civil service after graduating from Trinity, his mother was the more influential parent. An incredibly strong woman, Charlotte's family had ties to the Irish military, but she was also interested in improving the lives of the poor, especially the lives of poor women. According to Peter Haining and Peter Tremaine, Charlotte spoke for both women and the disabled, asked, quote, for equality of the sexes and the provision of dignified work for women, end quote, and wrote a pamphlet on female emigration from workhouses, 1864, that argued, quote, a self-supporting woman is alike respected and respectable, end quote. A member of the Statistical and Social Inquiry Society of Ireland, she also published on the necessity of a state provision for the education of the deaf and dumb of Ireland in 1863. Influential in other ways, Charlotte was possibly the source of Bram's enthusiasm for horror. An invalid for the first 7 years of his life, Bram had time to mull over her stories, as well as those of his nurse. Haining and Tremaine cite Enid Stoker, the wife of Bram's brother Tom, who remembered Charlotte's telling of the 1832 cholera epidemic in Sligo, which Bram incorporates into The Invisible Giant in Under the Sunset. Fearing both cholera and marauders, the family locked themselves in their home. When a looter attempted to break in, the intrepid Charlotte cut off his hand with an axe. She also supported Bram's work, commenting enthusiastically that Dracula, quote, was splendid, 1,000 miles beyond anything you have written before, end quote. Responding to a positive review a month later, Charlotte reinforced her previous praise, saying that, quote, no book since Mrs. Shelley's Frankenstein, or indeed any other at all, has come near yours in originality or terror. It should make a widespread reputation and much money for you, end quote. Charlotte might have provided him with the first model of the new woman, though that phrase would not become part of the lexicon for 20 years. And he worked with other independent women at the Lyceum. Trinity also encouraged his enthusiasm for current events, providing opportunities to explore them as a member of the most prestigious debating clubs, the Philosophical Society and the Historical Society. Elected president of the Phil in 1870 and auditor, the highest office of the Hist, in 1872, Stoker was responsible for the accounts of the Historical Society, as well as for delivering an address, the necessity for political honesty, at the Philosophical Society's annual meeting. After Trinity and work at Dublin Castle, Stoker moved to London, from civil service to theater, from preparing theater reviews to writing popular fiction, which he did mostly during vacations until Irving died in 1905. Dracula, the focus of this talk, is his most popular, as well as the work on which he spent most time, as is evident in Notes on Dracula and other studies of its creation. Dracula has been explored with every conceivable theoretical lens, and critics have left no headstone unturned. But this paper will focus on blood and the new woman. blood revealing the degree to which Stoker was influenced by traditional forces, the latter pointing to the future. The single trait that connects all vampires until relatively recently is their need for blood as a source of sustenance, and Stoker's vampires are no exception, though they are much more in terms of metaphoric resonance. It is evident that Dracula goes hunting for something to feed his brides, and equally apparent to Jonathan Harker that Dracula becomes rejuvenated by his diet. And this is a long quote from the novel. There lay the Count, but looking as if his youth had been half renewed, for the white hair and mustache were changed to dark iron gray. The cheeks were fuller, and the white skin seemed ruby red underneath. The mouth was redder than ever, for on the lips were gouts of fresh blood, which trickled from the corners of the mouth and ran over the chin and neck. It seemed as if the whole awful creature were simply gorged with blood. The coming night might see my own body a banquet in a similar way to those horrid three. This was the being I was helping to transfer to London, where perhaps for centuries to come, he might, amongst its teeming millions, satiate his lust for blood and create a new and ever-widening circle of semi-demons to batten on the helpless. End of quotation. Terrified that the brides will suck his blood, Jonathan also fears that he is responsible for transporting Dracula to England, where the vampire will have an endless supply of blood. And Van Helsing later reminds his young followers that blood is what enabled Dracula to live for centuries. Stoker, however, takes the fact that vampires across the globe are bloodsuckers and uses blood to reveal that vampires are creatures of the past. Not only is blood food for vampires, it signifies life itself, as Renfield observes to Dr. Seward, quote, "The blood is the life," end quote. The loss of blood eventually results in death, as in the case of Lucy Westenra, but sharing blood with a vampire is also a kind of unholy communion that can also produce spiritual death for those who succumb. Most important, though, in terms of Stoker's mulling over the events of his day, he uses blood to signify traditional family connections and thus to nod to the past. Shortly after arriving at Dracula's ruined castle, Harker is impressed by his host's stories about his noble ancestry. Quote, "Why, there is hardly a foot of soil in all this region that has not been enriched by the blood of men, patriots or invaders," end quote. Indeed, Dracula is proud because his blood connects him to an ancient past. And this is a lengthy quotation from Dracula. We Seckleys have a right to be proud, for in our veins flows the blood of many brave races who fought, as the lion fights, for lordship. What devil or what witch was ever so great as Attila, whose blood is in these veins? He held up his arms. Is it a wonder that we were a conquering race, that we were proud, that when the Magyar, the Lombard, the Avar, the Bulgar, or the Turk poured his thousands on our frontiers, we drove them back? We of the Dracula blood were amongst their leaders. Ah, young sir, the Seckleys and the Dracula as their heart's blood, their brains and their swords, can boast a record that mushroom growths like the Habsburgs and the Romanovs can never reach. The warlike days are over. Blood is too precious a thing in these days of dishonorable peace, and the glories of the great races are as a tale that is told, end quote. Claudio Vescia Vanini devotes an entire critical work to blood and images of blood in Bram Stoker's Dracula that analyzes the multiple meanings of blood. quote, as food for the vampire, as a symbol of nobility or family connections, and as a means for blood bonds other than kinship, end quote. Stoker, who according to Murray could trace his own lineage on his mother's side back to the 14th century, nonetheless uses his portrayal of both Arthur Holmwood, his only English aristocrat, and Dracula, to suggest to readers that the aristocracy is trapped in the past. Arthur, for example, visits his father when the woman he loves is also very ill. Dracula, despite his vast library of contemporary books and newspapers, seems incapable of adapting to the world of modern steam transportation. The two are also linked by their use of traditional titles and power relationships, and Zanini reinforces the connection by observing that the literary vampires that might have influenced Stoker were aristocrats. As Zanini notes, blood also connects the human characters, though often in ways that suggest that they are modern. Van Helsing, for example, comments on Seward's sucking the gangrenous blood from his wound, an act that links mentor and student, and furthermore demonstrates their scientific knowledge. In addition, even though Stoker was not aware of blood typing, and the transfusions of blood into Lucy do not save her life, these transfusions hint at the science of the day. For example, Van Helsing comments on the quality of Arthur's blood, revealing his awareness of contemporary science. Quote, he is so young and strong and of blood so pure that we need not defibrinate it, end quote. Kim Pellis explores the history of transfusion, which was often used to save the lives of women in danger of dying in childbirth in 19th century England, revealing information that Stoker might have learned from his physician brothers. And this is a quotation from Pellis. For nearly 75 years, English transfusion practitioners had attempted to control blood by defibrinating it, diluting it, and modifying its instrumental route between bodies. They went to this trouble because they believed that blood alone could reanimate patients near death after blood loss. At the beginning and near the end of this period of blood faith, English obstetricians turned to physiology for guidance about the fitness and methods of the operation. In the end, they found they could tame blood only by denying its vitality and therefore its therapeutic value. Small quantities of transfused blood could be replaced by far larger quantities of infused saline, turning what had been a grand and risky operation, performed by highly trained experts, into a relatively safe procedure that could be easily mastered. During the 1890s, blood transfusion quietly dropped from British medical literature, end quote. While the transfusions fail to save Lucy, Stoker uses them to provide an erotic connection between Lucy and the men who love her and want to protect her. Quote, just so, said he not that the transfusion of his blood to her veins had made her truly his bride? Yes, and it was a sweet and comforting idea for him. Quite so, but there was a difficulty, friend John. Then this so sweet maid is a polyandress, and I, who am faithful husband, am bigamist, end quote. Dracula too recognizes the erotic connection of blood during the scene in which he forces Mina to drink from his breast, blood that he had ingested from Lucy, and which combines the blood of the men who had loved her. Quote, and you, their best beloved one, are now to me flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood, kin of my kin, my bountiful winepress for a while, and shall be later on my companion and my helper, end quote. As a result, Quincy Harker, the son of Mina and Jonathan, shares the blood of Dracula, as well as the blood of the men who had joined to battle Dracula. His existence, as well as his name, suggests a connection in which the opponents of Dracula join in a new kind of family. Stoker's multiple references to blood suggest other things as well. The vampire's diet of blood might remind readers of an unholy communion, which leads to eternal death instead of eternal life. And numerous passages in the novel reinforce that blood is a reminder of human mortality. Early in the novel, Jonathan Harker is confronted by the three women in Dracula's castle. Quote, "The fair girl advanced and bent over me, till I could feel the movement of her breath upon me. Sweet it was in one sense, honey sweet, and sent the same tingling through the nerves as her voice, but with a bitter underlying the sweet, a bitter offensiveness as one smells in blood," end quote. The reminder of mortality is even stronger when Harker describes Carfax Abbey, one of Dracula's English homes. And here's a long quotation. "There was an earthy smell as of some dry miasma, which came through the fouler air. But as to the odor itself, how shall I describe it? It was not alone that it was composed of all the ills of mortality, and with the pungent, acrid smell of blood, but it seemed as though corruption had become itself corrupt. Faugh! It sickens me to think of it. Every breath exhaled by that monster seems to have clung to the place and intensified its loathsomeness," end quote. Harker's reaction reminds readers that Dracula is entirely a creature of the body. One more reference to blood in Dracula warrants our attention: the use of blood and or bloody as a curse in the novel, used primarily by the working class men encountered during their travels. I draw attention to it primarily because I don't think anyone has ever mentioned it before. Mina refers to Dracula's travels on the Tsarina Catherine, and here's a lengthy quote. "No one knew where he went or bloomin' well cared, as they said, for they had something else to think of, well, with blood again, for it soon became apparent to all that the Tsarina Catherine would not sail as was expected. The captain swore, polyglot, very polyglot with bloomin' blood, but he could do nothing. Then the captain replied that he wished that he and his box, old and with much bloomin' blood, were in hell," end quote. The scene is certainly not important, though it reveals that Stoker was a conscious craftsman who tells readers of the centrality of blood as a reminder of the connection to the earth and the limitations of the human body. Vampires and working class men are also characterized by their thirst, but that's a connection for another study. If Stoker's treatment of blood looks backwards at history and tradition, the new woman is au courant, a modern woman who is critical of tradition, especially the belief that women should be subordinate to men. Most proponents of the new woman believed that men and women should be equal in all things, and therefore that women should have access to education and the professions. The one area in which some new women disagreed was whether women should be as free as men to openly express their sexuality. Sarah Grand, who coined the phrase in a debate with Ouida in 1894, and whose character Angelica proposes to her future husband in The Heavenly Twins, 1893, urges chastity for both men and women. And The Heavenly Twins features one negative consequence of sexuality when Edith contracts syphilis from her licentious husband and dies after giving birth to an infected child. It's possible to read vampirism as a similar kind of contagious disease, But Stoker echoes Grand's marriage proposal in both Dracula and The Man, novel from the turn of the century. That Stoker is critical of these proposals might cause readers to assume he was hostile to the new woman. And I confess I initially shared that perspective. Glover, for example, describes both The Man and Lady Athelin as, quote, angry ripostes to the growing movement for women's suffrage, end quote. Richard Dalby and William Hughes refer to Stephen Norman's behavior in The Man when she proposes marriage to a man and wants to be her father's son as both fascinating and repulsive, and argue that by 1905, quote, the age of the new woman was effectively over, end quote, a point with which both Sally Ledger, a leading expert on the new woman, and I disagree. If I once regarded Stoker as largely hostile to the new woman, today I find his response to be more nuanced. Not only was Stoker close to his mother until she died, he was also friends with a number of other independent professional women, including the actresses Ellen Terry and Genevieve Ward, and new women writers, George Edgerton, whose name he borrows for a character in The Man, Elizabeth Robbins, and Grant Allen. Two excellent resources on the new woman are Ledger and Gillian Sutherland, though the two emphasize different aspects, with Ledger focusing on fictional treatments and Sutherland exploring employment and education. Ledger begins with a precise historical overview. Quote, the new woman was not named until 1894 in a pair of articles by Sarah Grand and Ouida. Gender was an unstable category at the fin de siècle, and it was the force of gender as a site of conflict, which drew such virulent attacks upon the figure of the new woman. These attacks were in turn closely related to the high profile of the Victorian women's movement in the late 19th century. The study will focus on the 1880s and 1890s, when the new woman had her heyday, end of quote. An earlier article by Ellen Jordan asserts that the new woman was criticized, quote, for aping the customs and habits and even rivaling the physical strength of men, end quote, and that the comic publication Punch was largely responsible for this hostility. Sutherland focuses primarily on women's education and work, and she moves from the caricatured woman in Bloomers to examine their economic independence. Quote, this study is therefore an attempt to resituate the new woman caricature and the broader debate of which it was a part by examining the opportunities for earning money, achieving independence available to middle-class women in Britain in the last third of the long 19th century, from about 1870 to the outbreak of the First World War, end of quote. Stoker, familiar with both his mother's insistence that women be able to support themselves, and with professional women writers and actresses, creates in Mina Harker a woman character who is financially independent before her marriage. That Stoker is thinking about the significance of the new woman is evident early in Dracula, when Mina reflects on the cultural phenomenon. In Whitby, On Vacation with Lucy, Mina describes a long walk followed by, quote, a capital severe tea at Robin's Hood Bay, end quote, and notes that their appetites, quote, should have shocked the new woman, end quote, an observation that suggests their behavior is not exactly ladylike. She follows this observation of unladylike behavior by echoing the Heavenly Twins, in which Angelica Hamilton Wells proposes to her future husband, quote, if Mr. Holmwood fell in love with her, seeing her only in the drawing room, I wonder what he would say if he saw her now. Some of the New Woman writers will someday start an idea that men and women should be allowed to see each other asleep before proposing or accepting. But I suppose the New Woman won't condescend in future to accept. She will do the proposing herself, and a nice job she will make of it too. There's some consolation in that, end quote. While Mina works as an assistant schoolmistress, is learning shorthand to help her husband in his job, is an accomplished typist, and resents men who try to protect her, Stoker reinforces that she is far from the sexually aggressive or mannish New Woman mocked in Punch. Even after her marriage, she is concerned at being seen holding her husband's arm. Quote, I felt it very improper, for you can't go on for some years teaching etiquette and decorum to other girls without the pedantry of it biting into yourself a bit. But it was Jonathan, and he was my husband, and we didn't know anybody who saw us, and we didn't care if they did. So on we walked. Mina's concern over impropriety here echoes her concern at finding the barefoot Lucy sleepwalking around Whitby in her nightgown. An episode on which Ledger comments, quote, Mina reflects in her journal that I was filled with anxiety about Lucy, not only for her health, lest she should suffer from exposure, but for her reputation, in case the story should get wind, end quote. Ledger goes on to explain Mina's concern by adding, quote, unescorted women in the 19th century were regularly mistaken for prostitutes. Nice women never went out unaccompanied, and this explains Mina Murray's concern for her friend, end quote. Despite her apparent criticism of the New Woman, Mina shares many of the characteristics associated with her. Not only is she employed, but she is also learning the clerical skills often associated with the New Woman, though she is careful to note that she plans to use them to assist Jonathan in his work. Quote, when we are married, I shall be able to be useful to Jonathan, and if I can stenograph well enough, I shall take down what he says, what he wants to say in this way, and write it out for him on the typewriter, at which I am also practicing very hard, end quote. Mina goes on to say that she had been influenced by journalists, many of whom would have been New Women. Quote, I shall try to do what I see lady journalists do, interviewing and writing descriptions and trying to remember conversations. I am told that with a little practice, one can remember all that goes on or that one hears during a day, end quote. Indeed, Mina uses the technical and organizational skills that many readers would have associated with the New Woman to assemble everything Dracula's opponents have learned about him, to track him down and destroy him. Even though Mina apparently plans to be a traditional support to her husband, her belief in her equality is also evident when she bridles that the men treat her as an inferior when they decide to protect her from knowing too much about their quest to track Dracula to his home. Quote, all the men, even Jonathan, seemed relieved, but it did not seem to me good that they should brave danger and perhaps lessen their safety, strength being the best safety, through care of me. But their minds were made up, and though it was a bitter pill for me to swallow, I could say nothing, save to accept their chivalrous care of me, end quote. Certainly, later events prove that the desire to protect her is misguided. Left alone in Dr. Seward's hospital, Mina is attacked by Dracula. Unlike her friend Lucy, however, Mina consciously fights against Dracula's power over her. While Mina shares a number of characteristics with the New Woman, her friend Lucy, who succumbs to Dracula's advances while sleepwalking in Whitby and becomes his first English victim, is presented as having only one characteristic of the New Woman, that of being sexually adventurous. Telling Mina about receiving 3 proposals in one day, she confesses a desire that women be allowed to have multiple husbands, though she quickly stops herself by noting that, quote, "This is heresy, and I say it," end quote. Nonetheless, this desire for 3 husbands is Stoker's way of connecting her to what Ledger describes as, quote, "the sexually decadent new woman, like the 3 female vampires at Castle Dracula," end quote. Though she struggles against those sexual urges while she is conscious, succumbing to them only as she becomes more and more under Dracula's control. Toward the end of her life, she is as fully seductive as Dracula's other brides. As Seward notes to his horror, quote, "And then insensibly there came the strange change which I had noticed in the night. Her breathing grew stertorous, the mouth opened, and the pale gums, drawn back, made the teeth look longer and sharper than ever. In a sort of sleep-waking, vague, and conscious way, she opened her eyes, which were now dull and dark at once, and said in a soft, voluptuous voice, 'Arthur, oh my love, I am so glad you have come. Kiss me,' end quote. Fortunately, Van Helsing is there to protect Arthur from acceding to his desire for a final kiss. Despite Van Helsing's best efforts to keep her from becoming a vampire, however, Lucy enters the realm of the undead, at which time she manifests yet another characteristic attributed to the new woman, her lack of motherliness. Like the women in Dracula's castle, who receive a bag from which Harker surmises is, quote, "a gasp and a low wail as of a half-smothered child," end quote. Lucy begins her vampiric career by feeding on children, who refer to her as the Bloofer Lady. Ledger comments on the fact that the new woman was often figured in discourse as at best a bad mother, and at worst an infanticidal one. Dr. Seward, who sees her with a child victim, is horrified by her reaction. Quote, "With a careless notion, she flung to the ground the child that up to now she had clutched strenuously to her breast, growling over it as a dog growls over a bone," end quote. The same scene reveals that Lucy is more than happy to graduate from children to adult prey, which convinces Dr. Seward that the woman he had once loved and wanted to marry is a monster who must be killed. Quote, "At that moment, the remnant of my love passed into hate and loathing. Had she then to be killed, I could have done it with savage delight," end quote. Indeed, Lucy and the 3 women in Dracula's castle are all destroyed in bloody scenes that suggest a degree of total hostility to the sexually aggressive new woman. What makes Stoker's handling of the new woman so interesting is his treatment of Mina. Not only does she accompany the men to Castle Dracula, but she is regarded as an equal during much of the quest to destroy him. She also witnesses Dracula's destruction, noting the possibility of redemption. Quote, "It was like a miracle, but before our very eyes, and almost in the drawing of a breath, the whole body crumbled into dust and passed from our sight," end quote. Dracula's destruction and the removal of the scar from Mina's forehead would have been a perfectly sensible conclusion, one that would have reinforced Mina's equality. Stoker, however, returns to more traditional ideas of gender when he has the group return to the same location 7 years later. Harker's brief note remarks that Arthur and Seward are happily married and that he and Mina have a son whose, quote, "bundle of names links all our little band of men together," end quote. Most problematic, however, is that the note effectually reduces Mina to the traditional roles of wife and mother. Having collected the material that enabled them to understand Dracula's movements and suffered for the men's mistaken ideas of chivalry, she is effectively silenced and returned to a traditional role for women. On the other hand, what reader of Dracula can ever forget her strengths? Instead of being the typical Gothic heroine, whose role in the novel is only to be rescued, Mina demonstrates new possibilities for women, if only for a little while. Stoker's treatment of the women in Dracula is a disappointment for many modern readers, since he brutally kills off 4 of his women characters and hobbles the fiercely independent Mina Harker at the conclusion. His future books demonstrate that Stoker was not done thinking about the new woman, however. Indeed, he continues to focus on new women characters in The Man, 1905, and Lady Atheling, 1908. Enthusiastically reviewed in Punch and The Bookman, The Man has attracted very little attention since, the exceptions being Roth, whose critical study of Stoker characterizes it as, quote, the most direct and lengthy analysis of female sexuality and behavior Stoker undertook, end quote. Glover and Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness, 1928, which echoes early sections of The Man. Stoker's heroine is Stephen Norman, and Hall's female protagonist, Stephen Gordon, and both Stephens try to be their father's sons, question conventional gender roles, and inherit property when their fathers die. Stoker's heroine is decidedly heterosexual, however, in contrast to Hall's lesbian protagonist. An only child whose mother died at her birth, Stephen attempts to follow in her father's footsteps, but often encounters problems because of her gender. Wishing to know more about her tenants, by accompanying her father to the Petty Sessions Court, she is told by her very traditional aunt that it would be improper for a young woman to hear, quote, low people speaking of low crimes, cases of low immorality, cases of a kind that you are not supposed to know anything about, end quote. Visiting an old friend of her mother, Mrs. Edgerton. Again, Stoker was friends with the New Woman writer Mary Chavalita Dunn Bright, who wrote using the pen name George Edgerton. A professor at Somerville in Oxford reinforces the traditional gender roles that emphasized women's inferiority. And this is a quotation from The Man. If indeed she was a woman and had to abide by the exigencies of her own sex, she would at least not be ruled and limited by women's weakness. She would plan and act and manage things for herself in her own way. Fortunately, her father wished her to grow up in manly ways. At last, she seemed to understand something of his purpose in her peculiar education. How strong and good it was. How she would henceforth bend herself to it, and would so fashion her own acts that they would not be tinged with the woman's weakness of which she had so painful an experience. Whatever her thoughts might be, she could at least control her acts, and those acts should be based not on women's weakness, but on man's strength, end quote. Believing in women's equality and learning that her spinster aunt had turned down several proposals, but remained unmarried because the man she loved most did not propose, and women of her generation were expected to remain silent. Stephen concludes that women's unhappiness stems from their passivity. Quote, why should good women's lives be wrecked for a convention? Why, in the blind following of some society fetish, should life lose its charms, its possibilities? Why should love eat its heart out in vain? The time will come when women will not be afraid to speak to men as they should speak, as free and equal. Surely, if a woman is to be the equal and lifelong companion of a man, she should be free at the very outset to show her inclination to him just as he would to her, end quote. Determined not to be passive, Stephen thus decides on a bold experiment to propose to an old friend, Leonard Everard. However, unlike Grand's Angelica, who proposes to a man who loves and supports her, Stephen's bad choice turns her down, and then, having reconsidered, attempts to blackmail her because he needs her money to pay his debts, a plan that Stephen and her aunt manage to circumvent. The remainder of the novel involves Stephen's realization that a better choice is Harold Anwulf, the man of the title. And the man concludes in typical romance fashion, with Harold and Stephen declaring their love for one another. Quote, in that divine moment when their mouths met, both knew that their souls were one, end quote. While this ending might suggest the triumph of traditional gender roles, the man also implies that much has changed in the personal and social circumstances surrounding Stephen, and that Stephen is a new woman. Stoker handles this transformation subtly in ways that echo his exploration in Dracula. The beginning of the novel emphasizes the power of the past, including the importance of blood in both Stephen and Harold. Stoker emphasizes Harold's Saxon ancestry, and Stephen's surname, Norman, points to the past, though her background is more complicated. Quote, the glorious mass of red hair, full, thick, massive, long, and fine, of the true flame color, showed the blood of another ancient ancestor of northern race, the black eyes, deep blue-black, or rather purple-black, the raven eyebrows and eyelashes, and the fine curve of the nostrils, spoke of the eastern blood, of the far-back wife of the crusader, end quote. Stoker emphasizes that neither Stephen nor Harold is limited by their pasts, however. Harold, for example, goes to the gold fields of North America and acquires a fortune, while Stephen inherits the earldom of Lannoy from a distant relative. While this inheritance might signify a link to the past, Stoker asks readers to see it as an indication of something new, because Stephen has a lifelong desire for justice, and she is not hampered by conventional gender roles. She inherits the earldom through the female line because the world is changing, as Stoker spells out in his discussion of the results of the Boer War. Quote, towards Christmas in the second year, the Boer War had reached its climax of evil. In the early days, the great losses were not amongst the troops, but their leaders. The old British system of fighting, when officers led on their men, had not undergone the change necessitated by a war with a nation of sharpshooters, end quote. Technological changes in warfare had destroyed many great English families, and Stephen reads in the Times that the Earl of Lannoy had died, having, quote, never recovered from the shock of hearing that his two sons and his nephew had been killed in an ambush by Cronje, end quote. Because there is no male heir, Stephen inherits Lannoy and consequently gains in rank. Her father had been a squire. By becoming a countess, the female equivalent of earl. The novel had opened with the adolescent Harold observing to Stephen that women were incapable of administering justice, and with Stephen's musing, quote, to be God and able to do things, end quote. The novel recognizes that as a powerful landowner, she will be able to do things. Lady Atheling, 1908, is the least studied of Stoker's novels, but it has the most to say about the new woman and the equality that women were gaining as a result of the Boer War and the technology that leveled the playing field and created equal opportunities for men and women. Its heroine, Joy Ogilvy, comes from a very traditional American family, and her description of her father reveals his ties to the past. Quote, "In Kentucky, we still hold with the old laws of honor, which we sometimes hear are dead in other countries. My father has fought duels all his life. The Ogilvys have been fighters way back to the time of the settlement by Lord Baltimore." She meets her future husband, the Earl of Athelney, when he rescues her from a runaway horse. What's interesting, however, is that their future will revolve around the automobile instead of the horse, a technology with which both Joy and Athelney are proficient, while her father is not. In fact, the automobile enables Joy and Athelney to discover their love for one another away from the prying eyes of the older generation. Such independence gives them freedom to express their feelings for one another openly. Unlike Mina and Jonathan Harker, who are sexually timid, Mina is even reluctant to be seen in public holding her husband's hand, Joy and Athelney openly express their passionate feelings for one another. A typical romance, Lady Athelney is full of misunderstandings among the generations, and the irascible Colonel Ogilvy threatens Athelney with a duel until it is discovered that, due to a quirk of Scottish law, the two are already married. Murray suggests that Stoker had been thinking about this law for some years. And here's a lengthy quote from Murray. In a letter replying to Stoker's queries regarding the marriage laws in Scotland, the Bishop of Edinburgh informed the author that perfectly valid marriages can be contracted by a couple's simply declaring themselves to be man and wife in front of witnesses, and then ratifying the agreement before a magistrate. The Right Reverend John Doden to Bram Stoker, January 20th, 1901, Brotherton Collection, Leeds University Library. Part of the importance of this letter is that it shows that Stoker was thinking about key episodes in Lady Athelney at least 7.5 years before the novel was published, end quote. An attorney, Stoker would have realized that the Scottish marriage law implies the equality of young people choosing one another freely, rather than depending on families to choose life partners for them. It is inherently future-oriented. Stoker emphasizes other characteristics that signify that Joy and Athelney represent the future. Unlike Arthur Holmwood, who is beholden to his father's wishes, Athelney is an orphan whose experiences in the Boer War make him critical of tradition. Similarly, Joy brings with her a new kind of American spirit. Much as she respects her father's connection with tradition, she will make for herself a new way. What is most interesting, though, is that Joy, Stoker's last experiment with the new woman character, is that she combines all aspects of the character, a desire for equality and an enthusiasm for sexuality that doesn't undermine her desire for children. A creation of the 1890s, the new woman remained influential into the 20th century, as Ledger observes, noting, quote, the new woman's continuing cultural significance in the early 20th century, end quote. Ledger goes on to mention writers who explore the new woman: Arnold Bennett, H.G. Wells, Joseph Conrad, D.H. Lawrence, and Virginia Woolf. By the early 20th century, the figure that was often criticized and made the butt of jokes in the 1890s had become a model of womanly behavior. Though Stoker explores a number of popular genres and uses conventions from all of them, he is consistently forward-looking. His novels explore characters who are trapped by their pasts, often underlying their ties either to family tradition or to biology, the power of blood. In his most interesting novels, including those that feature the new woman, he demonstrates an enthusiasm for new ideas and new projects, especially those that take advantage of new technology. Traversing the fin de siècle, his fiction demonstrates insights into a more enthusiastic perspective on the zeitgeist at the end of his career than it was at the beginning.
Thank you so much, Carol. As Carol mentioned in her lecture, Dracula is one of those remarkable novels that has never been out of print since it was first published by Stoker in 1897. However, Bram Stoker published many other works, including 12 novels and several short stories, which I'm afraid are much less well known and sadly rather harder to obtain. However, I hope that Carol's lecture has inspired you to seek them out, both as a good read, but also to enlighten you further on the attitudes, culture, and social issues of that remarkable Victorian era. Next week, we will be joined by Professor Walter Bodmer from the University of Oxford, whose lecture will be about the bloodlines of the British. I do hope you will join us again next Friday. Thank you very much.